This is Van Electric Ghost, and we're live on the air for the first time with Maria Macsay. Thank you for being on the Fan Electric Ghost podcast. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing really well. I'm grateful to be here and excited to have a conversation with you.
Want to let people know that we are a featured podcast on the Newsly platform. You see the icon up there says listen on Newsly. And for those who are listening or watching, if they use coupon code GHOST, they can get 1 month free subscription on that audio only platform. We are a featured podcast. We'll be on there later tonight on Newsly. And we also want to let people know that this is actually episode 1011 of the Family Electric Ghost podcast, tracking that on Apple Podcasts since 2016. And we also, for those of you who are just listening, we do have your website URL, and that's mariamaxay.com and /podcast gift breakthrough sessions. And that will be fully clickable when we're published. And so that's this, we always encourage people who listen to check out the URL to get a deeper dive. And then today, like the topic we wanted to talk about is why what women self-abandon and how to reclaim their natural radiance. So again, thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I feel like it's really fitting that this is episode 1011 for you because 11 is my favorite number. So feels like perfect alignment.
It's always fun. I just been doing this for a while, but it's just an interesting process. I feel like it's a master class, 1,000 hours worth of talking to people who know things that I don't know or are
Mm.
experts in their area. And I want to probably start with some of the questions. I think you sent me some additional questions that I could ask you. And one of them is, what do you mean by self-abandonment? And maybe you can kind of define that for the folks in the audience, maybe, or you can start with an introduction and kind of give a background to yourself and then address that.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe an introduction, like a small one, is helpful. So I have a background in dance as a performer and choreographer and shifted into yoga later on and got very interested in the body mind connection through eating psychology coaching and also somatic work. And so, what I do now is I work with women who are looking to bridge that body mind gap, whether that's to create greater confidence, to create clarity, to have more harmony in their relationships, to go after career change, or to even create their careers. So, what I've looked at and what I've seen quite a bit, and this is part of my own journey as well. So, it comes from an informed place. And with the women I work with, is this aspect of self abandonment. And what I mean by that is the tendency to forget about ourselves or to remove ourselves from our own expression, our own authenticity, our own desire. And so, what I mean by self abandonment is like when we've left the truth of ourselves behind, what we actually want, what we need, our dreams, our desires, for the sake of, maybe we'll get into this in a little bit, for the sake of anything like fill in the blank, whatever that value is for someone that they perceive they're going to get by putting themselves second or last, right? And this often develops at a younger age.
Was that kind of like the people pleaser syndrome, or the somebody
Yeah,
that,
it can show up
kind of
that
like,
way.
yeah, as a selfless, they think they're always not doing what they want to do, always doing what the other wants to do because they feel that's going to endear themselves to the other, or give them satisfaction in that way rather than their own goals.
Right. And it's actually seen as something really noble, I think, for in a lot of people, right? Like identified as something pretty noble. It's like you said the word selfless. And there's been a lot of judgment on selfishness as if it's a negative thing, when really, if we look at selfishness, it's like to be full of yourself, meaning your cup is so full of who you are that you're not trying to get anything from anyone to be who you are, right? And then you're just adding. So there's this concept of like we're either givers or takers.
Yeah.
And it's hard to be a giver when you're not full of yourself, when you don't know yourself, when you're not taking care of yourself. So, I talk about with self abandonment, it can look like, and I just speak from the perspective of the feminine, right? Because that's
Mhm.
what I know in my lived experience, and I'm sure you have amazing value to add to this conversation too from the other perspective, and there's many others. So to bring what I was gonna say in is this good girl conditioning can actually show up in self-abandonment, also like good boy, right? Like just be the good girl, which looks like I'm just gonna make sure everyone else is happy and then like I'm keeping the peace and I'm not ruffling any feathers and then everything will be fine. Well, what happens in that process is everyone else might be fine, but you're not fine. And then eventually there's a huge rub, whether that's within one's like psyche, right? Mind, body, soul connection, whether that's within their health, whether that's just within general satisfaction, which inevitably is going to bleed into relationships at some point. It's inevitable.
Yeah, I think what happens, like being a creator, I'm a songwriter, producer, I'm a software designer, I'm a creative. And
Yeah.
what I find is a lot of people, they feel like, well, if you're arrogant to think that you can do your own work, because there's a canon in poetry, there's a canon in music, there's a canon in painting, and I've talked to tons of creators. And there's always this like, well, this imposter syndrome,
Mm.
even among artists I work with, that they have tons of work that they won't show anybody because they don't think it's good enough. And even though they're in the field, they still don't believe a lot of it is good. And when I try to push them as a producer, I find show me the song you're the scared most scared to, or afraid to show anybody. And it's hard to get that because a lot of times they want to please me or they want to show they can do something that somebody else already did. And I said, well, they already did that. I,
Yeah.
I want to hear what you're doing. And so a lot of times it's like there's this thing where you don't feel you're good enough. You self-sabotage. You have all this work you won't show anybody because it's like you want to please everybody by just doing what they want rather than what is it that you want to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's so powerful that you invite people into that. I highly respect that, and, like, what a call forward. And, I read something recently around, like, imposter syndrome really generally shows up just before we're gonna have the opportunity to get good at that thing, and we've been an imposter at some other point, and then all of a sudden we weren't, and now we're feeling that somewhere else. But in general, I was reading too that it comes up a lot in high performers, so people who have a natural tendency to be quite high achieving, and that breaking that seal of, like, being, like, a meta performer versus a high performer is, like, that seal between being really interested in what we're capable of versus like how people are gonna perceive us, which I still navigate this. I notice the tendencies in me too that are like the imposter syndrome shows up or small moments of self-sabotage. And I think it's very human. It's more so about being able to hold it. And to your point, which even reflects back to self-abandonment, I think people are really concerned with how people are going to perceive them. Maybe not because we might not consciously care what someone thinks of us. Sometimes we do. But underneath that is the underlying need to belong and to feel safe and secure within community, right? Which goes back to like, it's ancestral. It is so far woven back in like our primal body because our body still remembers that we need each other to survive. The difference is nowadays we can actually be just fine without without that network on
Yeah.
a survival basis. It's really important to have community for our mental emotional well-being, but the survival instinct is not actually true anymore, though it can feel very true, and that can be the thing that's underlying whether someone stands up for themselves, uses their voice, taps into their desire, pursues their creativity, shares their art or not, because underneath it's like, I wanna make sure I'm loved and I belong.
Well, the wolf at the door, is like, is the words that you get from the critic or you get from your audience when you try to go outside the box. Because a
Mm,
lot of times, like, as an artist, you get put in a frame and you could be a 19-year-old kid and your biggest song get millions of views. That's what people perceive you to be. And
yeah,
then if you try to get out of that box because people don't know that you actually can do multiple genres, and that happened to be the one they liked. And then you don't necessarily want to stay there, but you're too scared to move out of that box because now you're kind of labeled as
yeah,
that. And that's always like the artist problem. And once in a while, you get guys like, you get people like Lady Gaga, you get David Bowie, you get Prince that would redefine themselves every album.
yeah.
We come up with a totally new stage persona every album, and it was like, oh, well, I like Purple Rain or I like 1999, but then they went to something else.
Yeah.
But we went from Ziggy to Lad Insane to Thin White Duke. He kept on changing, and it's hard to do that because the machine wants you to stay in something that's repeatable, and
Mhm.
they just want you to repeat what you've already done, and to push that is kind of against the grain.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that comes from, like, we live in a society that's very comfortable with identities and labels and, like, certainty. We definitely want certainty, and we want to know who we are and who someone else is, and we're more comfortable if things don't change. And yet, the irony is, like, comfort also starts to feel stagnant, and within stagnation is dullness, but we also want aliveness, right? So it's like aliveness and growth is inherently going to be a little uncomfortable. And so we kind of get caught between these polarities of I want comfort and familiarity, but the minute I have too much of it, I don't like it. And I want the other thing, but too much growth. And so that dance. And so that's where I think, like, really getting to know ourselves is so important, and getting to be what I'll call self-resourced, which is the ability to care for ourselves. So even if we put something out that someone is like slandering, or someone just doesn't get it because we changed our mind and changed sort of like our identity and the way we're showing up, even if that happens, if there's a lot of rebuttal around it, we can be like, wow, I'm feeling all the feels around this, and I got myself. But if I don't got myself, then I'm going to stay where I'm safer, where I'm going to stay
Yeah,
where, like, people accept me and people put me. And it's, yeah, I mean, it's not always an easy dance to be there.
it's like that codependency is like it is comfortable to stay in your codependency. It's
Yeah.
fearful to go out of it. So you could be
Yeah.
stuck in a bad relationship. You could be a bad relationship with your parents, with your loved one, with your friends, and you stay in that environment. You could be getting bullied, you could be getting abused, but like that's what you know. And
Yeah.
even though it's like, well, it's hard to perceive. Well, how could you be comfortable with that? Well, the fear of actually trying to get out of that box until you reach that crucible moment, it's not driving you enough to make you get out of it. You know,
Totally.
you haven't hit that wall that says, "Well, why am I doing that?" Well, now it doesn't work. So only like people don't you don't know when somebody's gonna hit that level where well, it doesn't work anymore. And then
Yeah.
suddenly they have to try it. And the fear is reduced and the wolf's not at the door as much as they can try.
Mhm. Yeah, and what I'm hearing you speak to is that window of tolerance, right? Like, we're as humans, we're very much still programmed to avoid pain, seek pleasure, but usually just avoid pain until the pain isn't too much, like it's okay. It's just kind of like a jabbing versus like force. And I think that the challenge becomes getting to know ourselves and like what we really want, and asking those questions, which for some is like even having the time and space to ask oneself that question could require more resources than, is accessible, let's say, or just more space than is accessible based on life, right? And so the ability to start to shift, okay, if I'm not creating a life out of avoiding pain, right? Which is still going to be a natural mechanism. What am I looking towards? What am I looking towards? What do I believe in? What can I conceive for myself? What can I imagine? And start to actually use the faculties of our imagination to conjure up, like, wow, this could be possible for me. And then look for evidence outside of ourselves that this is possible. Because if someone else is living it, it's possible for us too. Right. But we got to be able to have the courage. So I think courage is the piece that we're even sort of like touching on. Courage to try something new, courage to move towards the fear and walk through the door of fear. Uh, and I love this acronym for fear: false evidence appearing real. Because so often we walk through that door and we're like, oh, I'm not dead. And to your point of like something that feels codependent, whether it's a job or a relationship, it's like those moments of creating greater independence can feel like, like, is this going to be okay? And then little by little, as long as we're willing to move through the fear, we can actually create a lot of freedom. And that doesn't necessarily mean that anything needs to end. It's just about being willing to change it. having the
Yeah.
courage to transmute.
Well, a lot of times, like musicians I've run into, we get into this perfection mode
Mhm.
where like everything's got to be totally perfect. And a lot of times it's been addressed by some great artists like Victor Wooten, a famous bass player, was giving a master class showing people like there's no bad note. And he actually
Mhm.
went through multiple scales showing basically a rhythmic pattern that he just transposed to multiple scales and said, you could say this is the bad note. But if I'm feeling it and I don't react and you don't see me act like it's a bad note, then it's not a bad note. So if you live in that present moment, you can actually, because if you're just always living for the next note, and if you then you're thinking you're gonna miss it, you're not living in that moment. And you're not actually enjoying it. You have so much anxiety about it. You're probably gonna hit the perceived wrong note. So the idea is to like live in the present and trust yourself and also understand that happy accidents in what we call in music are opportunities to
Mhm.
actually take that piece to another level rather than trying to constrain it. You kind of take that muse and don't ignore it.
Yeah.
Actually, learn how to respond to it. And you can use that kind of methodology or mindset in everyday life, like riffing as a public speaker rather than staying on point everything that you wrote down or
Yeah.
being able to express yourself in a moment as an actor like in the method acting and like enveloping in the role and not exactly having the dialogue but understanding that role enough to be able to actually be that person.
Yeah. It's amazing what you're saying. I love that. And I'm really sourcing from my dance background and choreography and improv background because it's the same thing, right? Like when I was so, years ago when I was choreographing much more, um, those moments where something happens that's a mistake was like, this is like an opportunity was just born and this is amazing. Like now this is part of the piece. And so within like the notes that you're talking about, like I can't discover that if I'm thinking ahead to the next section of this dance. If I'm in it and we're in this moment and we're perceiving everything that's happening, taking it in, drinking it in, then we can catch that and expand upon it and realize something new. And to your point, I think that that's so true for life too, right? Like if I'm always a year ahead or 5 years ahead, then like I miss what's happening now. And what we're after is being here now after all, right? So it's kind of like
Yeah.
another irony thing that we humans do. We're like I do this too. Like I think ahead and then I get myself out and it's like, okay, wait, let me come back to the moment. And with that thing of mistakes, I think I was much better at realizing that when I was dancing much more and like improv dance was something that was so fun and you just can't be anywhere else but the moment. You just can't. How do you improv and be 5 minutes ahead? You can't. You got to be here
Yeah.
now. So even different than like rehearsing a move, right? And so that can be such a great translation to life. Like if we do something the same way all the time, for example, drive the same way to work or walk the same way to the car, do it differently, break it up, like aliven yourself, get present to now versus like, this is the way I do it. Do something different, spice it up.
Even like your expectations in your relationship, like if you're stuck in a pattern and
Mhm.
you expect your partner to, you're like anticipating what they're going to say, anticipating what they're going to feel instead of actually listening to what they how they feel right now. And because
Relationships are a
it does,
huge mirror.
yeah, and if you just you're putting your partner into this like I know this perceived partner is like your soulmate, it should behave a certain way because that's your expectation, rather than accepting how they're actually behaving and thinking that something's going to change in the future. Or like it's the kind of Victor Woden moment. Like why not live in the present and listen to what they're actually saying instead of anticipating what they're going to say or anticipating what they're going to do. Actually deal with the way they are.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of people don't want to do that because they have these expectations and they want to meet those expectations, or they don't meet the expectations, and it causes the conflict.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that goes back to like that there's some part of us that does that because it wants familiarity because that feels safe and like the unknown is unknown and uncertain and yet there's so much possibility in the unknown and there's so much potential for connection. So I love that example. Like if I'm holding a perception of how my partner's going to react to this thing that I say, then I might already be like, let's just say I'm imagining it's negative. I'm going to be in a defense. And the minute he says something,
Yeah,
I'm going to
jump
be defensive,
get
right?
triggered. Yeah, you get triggered right
And
into it.
then, yeah. And it's like we set the trap ourselves, but we don't realize it. So, like, it's so crucial what you're saying because it's really like, let me listen with my ears, but also with my body and with my heart and lean in with curiosity. That's something that I found is
Yeah,
super incredible because we all think that we mean the same things with the words that we say, but, like, the fundamental point of successful communicators is that they understand that we all have different labels for different things, right? So, when the one person says one thing, if I perceive that as, like, meaning something specific or something that's triggering to me, and I don't ask, "What do you mean by X?" We might be having a dialogue
yeah,
on
going like
those 2.
sideways, it goes
Yeah,
sideways.
and then we can't communicate, so it's super amazing to
Well,
be
a lot
able
of
to
times as a songwriter, I mean, as a songwriter poet, I purposely create situations like the famous like writing example is baby shoes never worn. So that kind of is a very like it leads you to interpretation. Or if you think about
Mm,
the Victorian poets, the concept of little death, it's like what does that mean? Well, it actually means like sexuality. It's like
mhm,
create the creation moment of sexuality, but they didn't say it that way. They said little death. So you got like, what does that mean? You got to unpack it. So a lot of times as a songwriter, we purposely make things kind of gray because we're telling stories, and we purposely want to leave room for our audience to kind of own it. Like I put it out there, but the audience owns it, and then they can take it, and then they can. I had an original idea, but I might have wrote it in such a way that like, is it really about me? But is it really about the macrocosm? It's about like a common human feeling. It's not just my feeling. It's not my personal situation that happened. I could have actually wrote it like a fictional story. And
mm,
it
mhm.
really isn't me. It's somebody else I knew and I write about, and you assume it's me.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that, and, I think that if what if we I just had this thought as you were talking, what if we interacted with each other as, like, poetry? Like, if I looked at, you know the person I'm in front of and just got curious and introspective and like I'm interested, I'm curious. It's like your poetry, your own expression of a human, how interesting and fascinating. And I think that we're only able to do that when we're doing it with ourselves, when we can be interested in ourselves, which kind of goes back to that selfishness, which is like it's really just to know ourselves and to be able to care for ourselves. And then there's so much less projection onto other people when we can do that because there's a sense of responsibility, being able to respond to the moment, being able to respond to the situation, claiming our part, which we don't get a lot of examples of in media of people claiming their part,
Yeah,
being responsible, being empowered. We get a lot of examples of victimhood and, self pity and how it's someone else and blame. And I
yeah.
think that while that may be more known, it doesn't seem to really yield fulfillment or happiness. And the more responsible we can get for our lives and responsible for ourselves, which part of that self abandonment track is to rewrite that, is to come back into being responsible for myself, which can be really uncomfortable if someone's put other people, I've been responsible for everybody else's feelings but my own. And so that can take some time to develop, but that really is, I think, at the base of what then allows people to come back into their creative essence, because I love that you're so into the music and the arts and creativity, and I really believe that we all have a creative spark. That might be, music, it might be dance, it might be the way that
Yeah.
someone mothers, it might be the way that someone, you know, I don't know, like writes, it could be the way that someone makes dinner, it could be the way that someone
Yeah.
organizes their shelves, but that creativity, which is like the spark that gives us that feeling of satisfaction.
Well, I think it's creativity is such an amazing thing. And I love to cook, and I know people like they're, athletes, they're creative in how they approach the game and how they
Mm,
actually work out the plays. And they're present like in that moment. They can read the room and they
mhm.
read the room and they understand what play to make, like playing chess. So
Yeah.
if you read that moment and you know what to do. And I think a lot of times I don't know, it's a connection I always felt back to the Victorians, this idea as an artist, we're kind of we channel and that we
Mm,
can pick up the muse. What's the idea of the muse? Well, somehow there's this universal art concept that's just out there in the world. And if you're an artist, you're in tune to it and you're willing to hear it and kind of push down the negative feelings you have or the things that you're scared of and actually willing to go with what the universe gives you at the moment. And part of it is all the things you've ever taught and all the practice you've done, but you're in tune to actually pick those things in life and turn it into art. You can turn melancholy into art. You can turn pain into art. You can turn happiness into art. You just take that moment or multiple moments, and whether they're yours or other people's, there's an
mm,
empathy, there's a vulnerability, there's an ability to assess and world build and build this. It's like sound painting or art painting. This idea that you can actually communicate with other people with common universal notes that they can pick
mm.
up on or vibrations and frequencies that people can pick up on.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it makes me think of this show that we just went to this past weekend and like the shared experience that an audience has. And we're all having different experiences based on what stands out to us, right? But the different experiences of sound and the creativity and like that is just something that, like, you can put that in front of so many different cultures and there's connection happening, or there's so many different people in the crowd and there's a connection happening, and then there's, like, a shared situation that's unfolding too, which is so beautiful, and to your point, I've recalled times where, like, I really use, like, the tough season to and move that through movement, right? Like, and I think that that's so useful because it's such a healthy way to let life be the muse and also let life be the inspiration. So whatever, whether it's something beautiful like you said or something challenging, it actually has a channel and we can process it. And I think that like emotional IQ is so much about how we're able to healthfully experience our emotions and channel them, right? Like we have examples of what doing it destructively can look like and then what doing it healthfully can look like. And to your point, I think art and expression and just any kind of, I guess, embodied because you're present. So an embodied experience can really have on our emotional well-being.
What I love about if you're a public speaker or a musician, like in front of a crowd, there's like that immediate feedback. And I'm a sound designer. What does that mean? I build my songs from the sound waves up. I take synthesizers, analogs, and keyboards and stuff. And I before I even do anything, I create the tone I'm going to use. And I
Mm,
create it from scratch to fit the feeling of the poetry or the vision I have for the song,
mhm,
which I talk about like an idea of sound paintings, which was an idea that the Beatles had and Hendrix had. There's a lot of artists that felt like their music could be seen visually, kind of like a synesthetic moment. And then when you build these sound waves into tones, you kind of know how that the fans react to it. And
mhm.
as a musician, if you're in front of a crowd, just like a public speaker, you're speaking sound waves, where
Right.
you're so sound waves, depending on how you do it, affect people's emotions, affect their body, they affect their heart, mind, soul, body, soul, affects everything. And so, like, if you realize that certain frequencies and beats and rhythmic progressions have an effect, funk will make people get up and dance. Something that's melancholy will make people kind of sad, like a Karen Carpenter voice kind of
Mm,
embodies melancholy no matter what she was doing. It kind of embodied melancholy the way she channeled that. People would pick up on it,
mhm.
even if the lyrics were happy. you
Yeah.
you still could pick up on her vibe because she's hitting that frequency.
Yeah. Yeah. That was the word I was just thinking about when you were talking is frequency and the frequency that we're emitting. And we're all emitting a frequency at the end of the day, right? Like whether we're singing or not, just our pure energy in a space is a frequency, which is really cool to know because it's like beyond the mind, it's actually so in the body as well. And that's
Hmm.
something that I love working with when I work with clients, which is like the embodiment of the frequency. It's like if I in my mind say like everything's fine, but in my body, I'm holding a stature of like I'm very rigid and my shoulders are up and
Yeah,
right, like
nonverbal communication.
nonverbal, and we all know this, like, we actually communicate much more words are the least important part of our communication, actually, so it's like our tone and our body language, precedes what we're actually saying, and so we're not fooling anyone, which is, like, kind of it's a little bit can be a little jarring sometimes, but it's also really beautiful because it just goes to show, like, that's how we can really, again, come into connection and notice with ourselves, am I disconnected? Like, is my mind over here, but my body's holding a certain kind of posture? And
Yeah.
so how to bridge the body mind gap, which is so much of, the journey that I've been on these many years, which is the nervous system coming into the body in like gentle ways, starting to notice our breath, starting to move the body, whether it's working out or yoga or dance, and just like any kind of movement that starts to fuse body mind. So when we check in with ourselves, it's not a split, right? So
Mhm.
the mind saying one thing and the body saying another. And psychosomatics is something that I love and I'm fascinated by. And there's actually a ton of research on it, which goes to show that the expressions that happen in the body, for example, symptoms, are so often a manifestation of a thought pattern or an emotional experience that has not been self-realized and
Mm.
understood and felt, right? But just like anything else, like you're talking about frequency before, emotions are energy, thoughts are energy. And if my mind is saying I'm good, but my body's holding the stature, there's an energy in there. And the more that I ignore that, and maybe I'm not consciously trying to ignore that, but the more people aren't led to find the guidance back to like, well, what is happening? Why are my shoulders up? Like, what do I need? And what's held there? Then over time, the body will continue to create louder signals so that we pay attention to it and start to uncover what we've been suppressing. So it's a really intelligent response. And we don't have to wait till it gets to that point. We can start to really tune into the physicality of what we're experiencing, energy in our body, and start to get curious, which is actually one of the ways that I sort of recommend. Like, if someone has that split or is in what we're framing for today as self abandonment, is start to get curious about the body and even just tune into sensation, right? Because the frequency of connection really comes from like knowing where I'm at first so that I can relate to another.
Yeah, it's definitely because there's a whole concept like in music of like dissonance and harmony.
Mhm.
And then there's like quiet and silence.
Mhm.
And when you get to be a really good composer, you start to realize, well, everything usually starts with the silence. Like you usually have to turn everything off and kind of get to a quiet space and kind of let the muse come in. And then you start to realize like sometimes the space between the notes has a lot of power. And some artists will kind of overdo it and overlay tons of layers because they're kind of like overcompensating because the peace and quiet kind of draw out technical errors or perceived mistakes. And so if you have lots of layers, you can't perceive the mistakes. But if
Mm.
you have more quiet, then you have to be technically on cue. You can't make a blatant error, people are going to hear it. And so this idea of like the dissonance and the harmony and the melody is like sometimes you need a little dissonance to kind of draw out the next movement, which might not be dissonant. So I like to create, music kind of like classical music has movements. In
Mm.
today's world, songs don't get enough time to have movements. People want to finish something in 2 minutes. I want my songs go like 9, 11 minutes.
I
So
love that.
they have lots of movements and changes, which a lot of people don't have the patience for. But I'm a child of the 70s, so I was listening to Yes and Genesis and Led Zeppelin, and they had songs that had movements, they had changes. They would go from
Yeah.
quiet to loud to quiet to, kind of just cacophony. Like that's part of the whole experience because you're telling a story. But
Mhm.
you can't really tell a story if you're just totally beat focused and focused on perfect melody and perfectness, and no imperfections. Then you don't have a chance to kind of stretch out. And I
Yeah.
think some people don't give themselves enough time to stretch out. They just want the quick hit, quick response, immediate answer.
So profound. Yes. And I just can't help but get so excited about the creative conversation and how it really relates to like emotional, mental well being too, and just well being in general. Like what you said around space, right? That space can highlight technical errors. And I think that that's so profound because it's like when we don't get space in our lives to connect with ourselves, to be present with ourselves, the technical errors can start to get, they'll just start to accumulate and then greater dissonance happens. And to your point, I love that like some dissonance is actually, it's almost like contrast. Like when I know that I don't want this experience, when I know that this is not the direction that feels aligned for me, then I can reroute. But if I'm never taking the time and the space to just sit with myself, which can feel crazy to people nowadays because of like the pace of our songs are 2 minutes or like, oh my God, that's too much. But if we don't take that time over time, the dissonance is going to start to accrue and then it's hard to be creative with it. Now it just is like one big like technical error in the way that needs to be addressed versus utilized and inspired from, right? So that's something that made me think about. And I think that the song lengths and this and the lack of space between songs, I'd never thought of this until we were talking about this, but it's such a reflection of where we're at as a collective. Like so much coming in so fast all the time, hard to get space and how important that is for us to be able to digest what's going on different levels, whether it's mentally, if I'm scrolling on a bunch of different apps all day, I'm not digesting the mental
Yeah,
material and it's like a backed up toilet. It's like really like a
yeah,
toilet that's about to overflow.
yeah.
No wonder we're going a little, wild. And even emotionally, if I'm not taking care of that and it's getting like to be a backed up situation, which it is for a lot of people, that sewer is eventually going to explode. And so it doesn't have to get to that point, but often that's what happens because people are just like on this fast now instant thing
Overload.
that's
Yeah, it's
yeah.
just a total overload because, like, like I still love to go back and read my Victorian poems and read Wordsworth and Lord Byron. And people today, they don't have the patience for that. Because
Yeah.
I was showing this other songwriters like that's too long. Because I was showing them like an epic poem, and so I can't imagine actually sitting down and reading this epic poem for pages and pages. But
Mm,
that's the art of that time period.
right.
And even going back like into the music in the 70s, song lengths are way longer. There's way more movements. There's a lot more complexity. There's quiet moments. People aren't trying to be perfect. A good example, like Neil Young. Neil Young can have a really awesome pitch when he wants to. He'll do a Nashville recording with a bunch of country guys, and it'll be sonically perfect. But then he'll go with Crazy Horse and be like a punk rocker and not care if it's perfect. And
Mm,
he will say, he called it at the time going into the ditch. And he said they did 3 albums in a row, and he called it the Ditch Trilogy, where he just went with Crazy Horse, and they did this kind of punk rock in an age where people weren't doing punk. He's like
mm,
72, 73, 74. He's like, people are like, "What's this? Either you're the guy from Buffalo, Springfield, or you're from Crosby, Stills, and Nash. Why are you not focusing on your voice and trying to make it perfect?" And he said, "Well, that's not what I'm into. I want to do something that represents my emotions, which is going to be maybe second, third take, not trying to redo it and let it be what it is at that moment." And I was
yeah.
very entranced by that. I was like, I like that. And I still like that feeling when I'm recording. I try to capture that like vulnerability and realism and just honesty of that moment.
Mm, I so greatly respect that. That's so it's so cool. And
It's a
it's
different
yeah, it's
mindset.
so real. It's a different mindset and it's learning to appreciate. Look, I know I can talk about self-abandonment stuff and perfectionism because it's something that I have journeyed with a lot and I still bump up against it. Um, but yeah, just it's like the energy that gets spent on that and like I almost like I do want to say um wasted on that process versus like being in curious flow and creation and like authentic expression and that vulnerability that uh is just so it can be so enriching and awakening is so cool. So I highly respect that that's part of your process too. And that's what I find like I went to something called ecstatic dance this past weekend and I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's just yeah, it's like a free flow. There's a DJ
Freeform.
set, free form. It's like a totally sober event. Like phones are put away and you're just in community dropping into music and movement and they're like if
It's like
it is the
happening.
most imperfect it's the most imperfect experience and the most raw and real, and it's the most joyful place for me. It is and the aliveness that's in that room with people making sounds or making faces or doing silly things or having deep processes, like anything is happening.
Hmm.
Anything goes, really, as long as we're respecting others, and respecting the space, like, that level of play and childlike nature and to see a room full of adults
Yeah, that's
doing that.
freedom. It's kind of a childlike freedom before you were told how to behave.
Yes.
And they like the whole thing with a lot of artists, find people, you guys are immature. See, why I'm immature because I choose to do something original, not unexpected, unpredictable, less controlled. Yeah,
Mm,
maybe that's immature because like immature is to sit in the cubicle and do the same thing 9 to 5 every day. And the artist is going to maybe do something that well, I don't expect that. I didn't really see that. I don't understand it. Well, that's the nature of like art
yeah.
of that childlike abandon that you can actually nobody told you can't do it. Like the idea when Orson Welles was doing Citizen Kane, he's like people came to me and he has a story where people were saying, well, how do you come up with these shots and the direction? So I didn't know what I couldn't do. I
Mm,
just thought I could lose my eyes and whatever I could see, the camera could do. So why not? Nobody told me like there were rules and I couldn't do this and I just did what I thought was possible. And nobody told me what wasn't possible, so I just did it. It's like that kind of abandoned people were like, "Oh, you can't do that," but because that's what people in the canon will tell you. Think you got
mhm.
to do it like A, B, C, D. You got to do it that way. And the
Yeah.
idea that you can break out of that just because, why not? People don't believe in themselves. A lot of times it's like you got to have that belief
Mhm.
that you can actually do your art, or you can actually speak that statement instead of being the person that doesn't raise your hand, doesn't say anything, and just letting everybody else talk, and then you don't talk.
Yeah. Yeah. Ugh, I love the question, "Why not?" And also it makes me think of, "Why not me?" Is a question to ask, and, gosh, you said one other thing that was really I once heard there's a difference between I don't remember who said this, but, there's a difference between childish and childlike, and
Mhm.
That's the difference between, like, do we mean childlike from the
No
perspective.
responsibility.
Right, or and childish is totally different, like, we could see that as immature, right? It's kinda like there's certain things that we wanna be able to access and grow into and develop into, but childlike is, like, innocence and it's curiosity to me. It's
Mhm.
playfulness,
Yeah.
it's fun, it's curiosity, and I love that what you said, it is the opposite of self-abandonment. It's actually having abandon within oneself, which is like totally being in oneself in the moment and owning that and being present to life. And yeah, I think that the just any creative venture is so helpful to tap into that quality.
It's like that art therapy. Like I've talked to so many
Mhm.
therapists that say you take somebody that feel they can't be creative and you get them to like paint, even though they say, "Well, I can't paint." You get them into do it. You just do it. Just come up with something. Don't have any expectations. Just do it to try to feel it out.
Yeah.
Or somebody in different. You take different types of art forms and you use it as therapy. Whether you're
Yeah.
banging on a piano, you don't really know how to do it, but you give them the permission to touch the piano. I mean, that's
Mhm.
how I got into playing piano. I was able, so I gave myself permission because I bought one. I didn't know how to play it. I said, well, if I own it, then somebody won't tell me I can't touch it. And then I'll actually go and experiment with it because now I own it. So then nobody can tell me I can't use it. And that's what happens with a
Yeah.
lot of musicians is they get their instrument and say, well, no, learn it because they get so passionate about it and they want to have their own. So somebody doesn't tell them to go away and they can't use it. They go and they learn it. 'Cause, like, now they if they own it, nobody can tell them they can't touch it.
Yeah. It's so cool, everything that we can pick up, and that's so cool that you did that. My brother did a similar thing with a guitar. Like, he never had formal lessons, but he just started being curious about it, picked one up, and started going into that process of learning little by little, and he's gotten really good over time, and, there's that necessity to be willing to mess it up. I was gonna curse, but I don't know what
Yeah,
the
yeah, you can do
logistics
that.
are on that.
Yeah,
But
that's part of it. That's the accident. That's the accident. I mean, that's you don't win by winning every game.
Yeah.
You is a lesson learned. Every athlete knows they don't win every challenge. They practice, and there are things that you mess up. And every
Mhm.
musician, you learned how to deal with your instrument. You learned how to understand it and get in tune with it, and then learn how it works and then how you work. And then your take on it and your take on it. Everybody's individual take as a musician is their own stamp on the form. And
Yeah.
that's where a lot of people don't understand. It's like it's actually okay to, have somebody that doesn't know piano play piano and sing that song because then it's going to be uniquely them. And a lot of people have figured this out that they'll go and take an instrument that they don't really know and do something on it, like a bass player go to the guitar or a piano player go to the guitar and the guitar player go to the piano because the result is usually something very different because it's a different
Mhm.
perspective. And sometimes that perspective is very enlightening. It's something that a piano player would have never done or the
Mhm.
bass player would have never done. And it's like that's how you move forward is not just being a virtuoso, but being willing to challenge yourself
Yeah.
into something that you're not fully comfortable with, which I think is kind of like the process of life. Like that's the way things are going to be till you're not here.
Yeah. Yeah, and just getting really honest about that and, like, confronting that, I think can make the process maybe gentler, like, it's not meant to be done perfectly and super, like, well, and part of this self-discovery is being willing to discover ourselves in something new, and what you just spoke to is a perfect example of the show I mentioned earlier that we went to this past weekend, which was every member of the band, they, like, rotated throughout the show, and they each played the instrument. Like, it was incredible to see them switch from guitar to the bass to, there's this, like, frequency machine, it's, like, called the Moog or something. I'll have
Yeah,
to
Moog, yeah, Moog,
Moog,
theremin.
yeah, it was
Yeah,
amazing.
yeah, that's a cool thing.
And it's so cool. And, there was one of like, drums, guitar, bass, and all these other instruments, and they were rotating, and I was like, "Wow, that is so impressive and so inspiring to see, like, that level of genius come on." And what is genius? Like, in that moment for me, what that meant was just the ability to be so well versed in various forms of expression and with various instruments, which must mean that they had to go through like a massive process of like it sounding awful or making
Yeah.
mistakes or it was clunky. But we get through that to then like get to the ability to be able to do that so well. And that was just, it was really inspiring to just consider the process that each one of those artists would have gone through to be able to achieve that and as a band too.
Well, I think in life, you have to look at things as like, they're problems we get, and do you just use the same solution, or do you
Yeah.
come at it from different angles? Right.
Yeah.
And a lot of times people just want to use the same algorithm or the same formula because that's the only thing that can work. And then what happens in science, we find there are theorems that get broken. There are new things that it finds like, that isn't actually true anymore
Mhm.
because you keep on pushing it. And then you keep on like trying to like prove or disprove. And so I think, there's a lot of people, like you said, they like the predictability, but on the bleeding edge of innovation, there's all these people who are kind of in the new frontier. And with
Mhm.
the people who go into that new frontier, they sometimes, there's a lot of criticism. There's a lot of criticism of the person that doesn't do it the way that everybody's always done it.
Mhm.
But that, then everybody says, oh, wow, now you have something new because the person's willing to do that. And so I think people in their lives, they have a lot of things they could do. And are
Yeah.
you going to regret the things that you didn't try
Mhm.
because you were scared? Not that everything you're scared of is good. There's a good reason why you're scared because your body's trying to protect you. But there's some things that are like that's a wolf at the door, and there's real no consequence other than like you've got an irrational fear. But
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I definitely think that, much more often, especially if we're talking about, you know, I'm based in the US, I think you are too. Like, for the most part, when we have access to certain things in our life, most of the fears are the wolf at the door. The ones that are really about survival, we know, and that's amazing to know. And so it's just good to question, uh, be able to be willing to ask the question, like, what are the stories I'm telling myself? Because the story I'm telling myself is likely creating the fear, and is it based on something true? Is it actually true? Do I actually know for sure that it's true? And how would I show up and who would I be if I created a different narrative? And if we can see that there's a new narrative that would come online, well, then it's probably that the fear is the illusion, and that there's a possibility for us to walk through that door and realize, like, everything's all good. There's actually opportunity here if I'm willing to at least digest the fear.
well, I think it's, we've been talking about like you got to have self discovery. You got to be
Yeah.
brave enough to go into the looking glass and see all the refractions and
Mhm.
understand that, beauty is in the refractions, is in the
Mhm.
things that aren't perfect. And all the things you're down on are probably your strengths. And
Mhm.
that's what the people, that discover, they say, well, how did that person get the arrogance to jump on stage? It's like, well, because they looked at that refracted looking glass and they saw something cool in themselves and they kind of doubled down on it. And then they did this, were able to own it. And it's the law of attraction. Like if you're down on yourself, then that negativity is going to probably lead to certain things within your body, mind, soul, spirit that are going to lead you down a path. If you're up on things and you're in that kind of moment where you're drawing all this positivity, then good things seem to happen. So why are these good things happening? Because they're in that place, and there's
Yeah.
the kind of sweet spot that it's not foo foo. It's kind of it's real. But if you think it's foo foo, then you're probably not going to get there.
Yeah, exactly. You've already discounted it. Yeah, what a great place to, like, really sort of, like, bring that to, which is the self-discovery and also the choosing what we're focusing on. And, like, again, back to frequency, because that's creating a state within us. And the state in which we're in is what's going to inspire our thoughts, whether those are creative thoughts or reactive slash destructive thoughts. So, I love something that I bring to some of my clients, which is that reactive and creative are actually the same letters. They involve the same letters. It's just the organization of them. So when we can see something differently, we can be creative versus reactive. And so it's just good to, it's a nice little barometer. Like, am I being reactive or is there potential for me to be creative here?
Yeah, that's how I live my life with my bedroom studio in front of me and doing these live podcasts that I feel like are master classes. And
Mm,
we're kind of at the close because I do have another one. I could
yeah.
talk for another hour, but this is really why we do the podcast is that we can have these open discussions that are longer than 15 minutes where we
Yeah.
can get into something that people don't get a chance to talk about or don't get to hear somebody explain these concepts. So again, to further dive into this with the clicking on your link of mariemacsay.com, and that will be fully clickable. You can click on that full link and it'll get there. Maybe tell the folks what they find there if they
Yeah.
click on that.
Yeah, so if you click that link specifically that's here, that will be a gifted free 30-minute like drop in with me, which is connected to body-based coaching. So it's going to be a lot of the principles that we talked about today to get in touch, bridge the mind body gap to overcome a major block that someone's facing. And so we can do that in as little as 30 minutes, which is really exciting. So that's totally free and a gift. And then if you're on there too, you can poke around my website or find me on Instagram and we can connect there.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for being on the show. Sometimes we have people come back on again, and just in the future, if you ever wanted to do that and address other issues or have a book to push or a program to push, we're into that. You can check us out on our calendar, invite. You can figure out if in the future you want to do that. Thank you very much for being on the show.
I appreciate it so much. This was such an enlightening conversation. Thank you.
Have a good night.
You too. Thank you so much.